Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me this week is Phoebe Watson.
Hello!
And we are certainly taking this podcast on the road because we are coming to you at the moment from Rome.
Very exciting.
Yes, Phoebe and I are on holidays in Rome, although Phoebe will be leaving me shortly to go on to Japan.
I depart from my mad adventures.
Yes, and I don't know whether it's part of my hope to make this a very deeply culturally enriched episode or just my lack of organisation that I didn't get a podcast recorded before we went.
Well, we did also discuss the topic, which was very appropriate for where we are.
Yes. So this week's episode is going to be about architecture and Catholic architecture and buildings and how we understand buildings as spaces from a Catholic point of view. So naturally, obviously, it makes sense in some ways to come to Rome and talk about that.
Yeah, we have just spent our last couple of days looking at the most amazing church buildings in the world.
Well, speaking of the most amazing church buildings of the world, it's perhaps a little sad that it's also very fitting. We did actually choose this topic a while ago. Specifically, we were talking about it just before Holy Week. And I distinctly remember we talked about doing this episode and saying we should talk about Catholic architecture. And I said to Phoebe, oh, this is wonderful because I'm currently reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame and it's just got all of these incredible descriptions of architecture in it and we could totally use that. Right after that, I picked up my phone and saw that Notre Dame was on fire.
It was like 2 days later.
No, it was
it not?
It was a minute later. As in, I said it to you, I picked up my phone and Notre Dame was on fire. It was a really...
Oh gosh, yes you did.
It was a really surreal experience for me.
Yeah, because I kind of looked at you as like, oh, I don't understand that. I can't compute.
So, yeah, it was a really kind of strange. I'd just been talking about it. I picked up my phone and Notre Dame was on Twitter and I was like, what's going on? And then it was on fire. So it is a bit sad that it's very fitting that we're talking about this topic. But like I said, it sort of predated the terrible fire, which thankfully didn't destroy the cathedral, which is, I consider, something short of a miracle. But yes, so in all, between news events and the eternal city, this is a very fitting topic for us today.
Yes, it is.
So I think I will give a little bit of background, which is that before coming to Rome, I was incredibly sick with some food poisoning, and so I have not got as much prepared for this episode as I would like, so I don't necessarily know exactly where we're going to go with this, but I think we should begin maybe with our terrific tour at the start of the trip, which was given by Elizabeth Lev, who was just unbelievably stunning and wonderful, and I am, itching to buy all of her books right now.
Yeah, it was just the most amazing tour ever.
Mm-hmm.
And we had like one fairly meh tour and one pretty good tour afterwards.
Yes.
And I think we've both had other tours before that have been good.
Yeah.
But on comparison, like that stands out as an absolute mega highlight.
I think the thing that really struck me was that the reason why I was maybe a little bit anxious about doing a tour is that because, like we said, I've been on tours before, and the thing I often find with sacred architecture tours is that either it's one long theology lesson on things that I already know, or it's an art history lesson that seeks to demean the sacred element of it. This was something completely different because Elizabeth Lev has that incredible ability to marry the two and have such respect and understanding and knowledge about how religion and Catholicism and Christianity all have this place within the art history and within the architecture of these spaces and how both amplify each other, and that it isn't one or the other. And I think that's the thing that we want to talk about most today, which is about how we can marry those two spaces and what it means to give glory to God in a space.
Yeah, how art and architecture are so intertwined and how, particularly in these fabulous churches, it's not, oh, you have the art and then you have the building.
Mm-hmm.
They are one and the same.
Yeah. And I think the thing that impressed me the most in the tour was weirdly not actually the churches, although we did get to go see Santa Croce with the relics of the Holy Cross on the feast day of the finding of the Holy Cross.
That was incredible.
And
it was also an unscheduled stop. We had to take a detour, and then Elizabeth Lev went, we'll just stop over there. There's a reason we're doing it. Oh yes, it's because it's the feast of the finding of the Holy Cross, specifically for this church.
Yeah, so that was very exciting and very moving. But the section of the tour that actually kind of fascinated me the most was the start, where we went up the Capitoline Hill and then looked at the Roman Forum. But she was explaining how the piazza at the top of the hill used to face towards the Forum and had been moved, and I think it was Michelangelo who did it, wasn't it?
Yeah, it had fallen into disrepair.
Yes.
And then they were redoing it and kind of trying to reinstate some of the Roman glory.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of just reinstating it looking out over the Roman Forum, they turned it around so that it faced towards St. Peter's to represent the conversion of Rome from paganism to Christianity, and that you kind of going from the pagan to the Christian, but that you're not, there's a continuity there as well. Yeah,
to me that was just this incredible idea of like turning something on its axis so that it faces Christianity, and I just found that really moving and very, very inspirational, that architecture could be so representative of a whole civilization reevaluating itself and reassembling itself towards a particular set of values and goals.
Yeah, and that they do that without putting in a church. It's not that they built another church there in the place of where the Temple of Jupiter was, facing towards St. Peter's. Mm-hmm. They put in steps where the city wall was to show that now new accessibility, and they have two Roman gods facing towards St. Peter's.
Yeah. And that ability of Christianity at that time and Catholicism to take what has been good. And I think that's what comes through so much in Rome, is this ability to take what was good and then orient it towards Christ. And we see that with the missionaries as well. Like, I think it comes up in so many different ways. The edict when they were going to Ireland and England was baptize their holy wells and their shrines, just keep their sacred spaces that are imbued with meaning and are soaked with prayer, let's say, and say, well, that is a good thing. And now let's take that and orient it towards Christ.
Yeah, but I think even the more fascinating thing about this one is that it's also rebuilding. So it's a pagan culture that has fallen into disrepair. Like you have the ruins of the Forum.
Yeah.
But then you're actually reinstating something pagan that was good and reorientating it.
Yeah.
That it's not even that what was pagan is there and you're just going, oh, that's actually this. Or we can make that holy in this way. But you're rebuilding it.
Yeah. And she was explaining how Castor and Pollux were these gods that were so foundational to Rome and were about fraternity and about working together and using people coming together to create something better.
And man becoming God.
And man becoming God and God becoming man because of their stories of...
No, just man becoming God.
Yes, sorry, of course, man becoming God. And the idea that there is something to be gained from the sharing and interaction, and that like working together you can become a deity.
Yeah.
And then she sort of said, like these two Jewish guys walked into the Roman Forum.
A fisherman and a tent maker walk in and say, no, you've got it wrong. Man doesn't become God. God became man.
Yeah.
And then how Peter and Paul become the new founding twins.
Yeah.
Because they die on the same day and are born again in heaven the same day. That was just like the most mind-blowing point of the entire thing.
It was so good. It was really, really incredible. And how that represents itself in the architecture, and in some ways because you've got St. Peter's right at the heart of Rome, and then you've got St. Paul outside the walls, like almost like they're encircling the whole thing, that like wherever you go you're going to hit these two figures, which is so cool and striking.
Yeah, but I think it also makes a lot of sense for us in why they're always portrayed together.
Yeah.
Like in St. John Lateran, you have above the altar the two figures of Peter and Paul together. Yeah. They're portrayed as the new founding twins in the art and the architecture as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just reading on about the theology of architecture, and it was talking about how using architecture to express our theology has been a part of our imagery since the Bible, because of the way that we describe Peter as the rock. We are the pillars. Jesus is the stone that the builders overlooked. Or even in Revelation, where it talks about the living stones of the heavenly Jerusalem. And even just the fact that we understand things of like, we are the church, like we are a building. So that there's this idea that our expression of God becoming man, as we were saying, is totally fitting in architecture, that this is something that totally makes sense within our religious view to express ourselves through buildings, because it's always been there in the scripture.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And then also you've got, coming from Judaism, the importance of the temple, and that whole idea of the structure, and then Jesus is the new temple, which means that you can also recreate that in any space.
Yes.
You're also not obliged to make it the same, because you don't have to copy the Temple of Jerusalem, and you're not obliged even like make it the same in the same scale. Like you can have a tiny church of beautiful architecture. And I think there was another point, this creating of the beautiful spaces for the Mass, and the idea that we make it as beautiful as possible for the Mass, but that we can do that in any space because we have the incarnation of the Eucharist.
Yeah, that's so true. And I was just thinking that I think we're going to go on to discuss more about like specific examples of architecture and their sort of splendor or glory. But I know some people who actually don't find that kind of space the best space to pray. But just because something is maybe simpler or plainer doesn't mean it's not beautiful. It isn't the same as just saying like put it in like a bare room. Like we were lucky enough to have adoration just for our group in the Church of St. Philip Neri last night, and we were in one of the side chapels, which was designed by Borromini, and it has all of these inlaid marble, and it was super sumptuous and intense and beautiful. But beforehand, we were getting a tour of the rooms of St. Philip Neri and surrounding rooms of the church. And I think Phoebe and I, our favourite part was we kind of like broke away from the group to sit in just the side oratory, which was sort of wooden clad and had a painting, but it like compared to, let's say, the sumptuous chapels that we were just about to go pray in.
I think it was actually the nuns' chapel. So it wasn't even the chapel of St. Philip Neri. It was like where the nuns now meet to pray.
Yeah, and it was beautiful dark wood, and they had like a veil over the tabernacle, and
in some ways the tabernacle was the most beautiful thing there, because the whole square room faced into the tabernacle.
Yeah, and so there is a point that says that you can do simple small things with great precision and great beauty and great reverence, and so in a simple space you still have something that is almost sumptuous, even if it's simple, and has that sense of reverence and beauty and awe, and that moves you to the transcendent. So I would like to preface to say that I'm not actually arguing that all spaces or even all sacred spaces need to be covered in gold or decorated to the hilt, which is actually something we're going to discuss later, but that even simple things can be done very reverently.
Yeah, I think there is also a way of entering the sacred space as a pilgrim rather than as a tourist. And it's very hard to do the first time you go in.
Yeah.
I think, especially the first time we went into St. Peter's this trip, we were in quite a hurry because we were trying to get to the crypts underneath St. Peter's for Mass. So you come into this amazing, incredible, gigantic space of art, and you're like, we have to get through.
Yeah.
Whereas the next day I went in, and I didn't have a schedule. I didn't have anyone with me. And this was maybe my third time seeing it, so I wasn't on my phone trying to take pictures. It didn't need to be recorded. I was just able to enter it in like, I'm here to pray.
Yeah. And that's actually what I'm hoping to do, please God, for the next couple of days. I'm staying in Rome a couple of days after our group leaves, like you said, because the last time I came, I just remember being in these spaces and saying, I wish I just had the time to be really present. And it wasn't that, like, I was with my friends and they were all super ready to pray. We prayed at all of the churches. It wasn't just touristy for us. But at the same time, you can't necessarily take your time in the same way when you have a set number of days and like you kind of want to cover a certain number of things. So I'm looking forward to that and hopefully it goes well. And I think both of us have found we've taken almost no photos this trip. And I think back on when I was here for the first time and I just took endless photos. And I try not to get too caught up in judging people for that, because I really understand that impulse and you see this beauty and you want to hold on to it. And, you know, it is something that is important. So you want to hold on to it. And
you want to be able to recapture that experience by knowing, I can get in a certain way we talk about you can get postcards of these beautiful pieces of art, which is a great way to keep them. That's actually one of our favourite ways because you can get a much better picture.
Yeah.
But in a certain sense, I can also kind of understand the idea of taking the picture in the hope of being able to recapture the experience that you had yourself.
Yeah.
It just doesn't always work.
Yes. And so it's been very freeing to come this time where we've gone back to a lot of places that we've been before. And even the new places, I just haven't necessarily, because maybe for the rest of the day I haven't been taking pictures. It maybe hasn't been at the front of my mind to just go start taking pictures.
Yeah, the minute you're out of that like impulse, it can be very freeing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think overall we should maybe talk a little bit about the need to enter into a reverential space in prayer, because I think that's a discussion that comes up at least a lot with my secular friends, which is about, and certainly in the context of Notre Dame, and people started paying in, hundreds of millions to restore it. And why do you need these opulent spaces? And do they contribute anything to your faith? And the classics, couldn't that just be used for the poor? Even though, these churches are also for the poor.
Yeah, it's like, well, actually, you've got the most beautiful expressions of art in history, and they're free.
Yeah.
They're completely open to the public. All you have to do is queue up and get through security.
Yeah.
The most some of these churches do is ask you to put in a €1 donation to light up some of the side chapels.
Yeah. I think I covered this a little bit with Matthias in the episode Restoring Catholic Weirdness, about how when something is transcendently beautiful, which I think most people can agree, given we see how many people go through all of these spaces every day in Rome, I think it's telling that people don't queue up for buildings that are, I want to say more recent. I'm not just slandering all, because I'm sure there was plenty of ugly buildings in the past.
They've just been destroyed now.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to look at the world through rose-tinted glasses, but, I don't know what building inspires that kind of dedication or awe that has been more recently built in a more modernist and pared back style that is so kind of ubiquitous across architecture at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it is very telling that in any of these spaces, they always have space set aside for prayer. So in any of the main basilicas, they'll have a side chapel with the Blessed Sacrament reserved, or sometimes full adoration, that's screened off and reserved for prayer. And they'll even have, like particularly in St. Peter's, they'll have a guard there going, no photos before you in, and you have to pretty much go, I'm going to pray with your hands together. Like, please let me go pray. But then they're very nice and they let you in.
Yeah.
Like the first time we were there, because we'd had mass at the crypts, then we'd come back up to the basilica, and there was a part of the basilica that I hadn't been in before because it'd been closed the last time. But the only way you could get in was to go into confession. Like they had confession boxes, and it was like if you were going in for confession, that was where you went.
Yeah. And
it turns out I was looking for confession anyway, because like 2 days before that I'd been like, oh, I should really get confession before I do all this travelling, but I can't. I literally have no way to schedule that in.
Yeah.
So, God, please give me a chance to go to confession. Next morning, boom, there you go.
Yeah, I think it's so important that those spaces continue to be sacred spaces. And that's a big discussion that's come out of Notre Dame. Like, oh, it's cultural heritage. Oh, it's, Paris's history. Great.
Why is it Paris's history? Because it's about God.
Yes. Like, the building doesn't exist without a concept of working towards something that was bigger than you. And that those buildings only make sense in terms of orientating it towards the mass. And
yeah, I think there's a big difference that we see between churches and museums, which can be quite difficult to communicate in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Because you've got the Vatican museums, where actually even from St. Peter's, they've taken some of the great works of art and preserved the originals in the Vatican museums and then done a replica in the Basilica. So you can see the actual piece of art as it was with proper lighting and preserved as it should be in a space where you can see it. But you also then have to try and understand that piece of art, which is now in a museum, in the context where it was originally designed to be.
Yeah.
So there's one of the Raphael paintings, which is of the Transfiguration. They now have a mosaic copy in one of the altars in St. Peter's. So it's meant to be an altarpiece. It's designed for the celebration of the Mass. And the tour I had of the Vatican Museums the last time I was in Rome, which, by the way, was by the nuns who are the official tour guides of the Vatican Museums. And they're really good. So if you're looking for tours of the Vatican Museums, I think that's a really good place to try. But yeah, it's an image of the Transfiguration. And she was just saying that you have to look at it in the context of an altarpiece. You have to understand the light of Christ coming out and almost the circular light around Christ as a reminder of what the Eucharist also is and what is happening on that altar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was saying the same thing about the Pietà. Now, obviously, anytime you see the Pietà, it's a moving experience. I don't think you could take away from that. But it makes so much more of a profound statement if you understand it as an altarpiece, which is what it was. And that description, I'm trying to think, it was someone famous who described it as Mary is like a mountain with Jesus flowing like a river down her. And there's that long arm of Jesus pointing down. And in that context, it would be pointing towards the Blessed Sacrament. And even just that whole concept of Mary's offering of her sacrifice and Jesus' offering of his own sacrifice in the form of the Blessed Sacrament that is encapsulated in that piece that is so moving when you think of it in the context of the Eucharist.
That's so beautiful.
And that at that point, Jesus is almost the table as well.
It's almost an altar in itself.
Yeah.
Mary's lap is the altar.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the context of those things amplifies their meaning because, like we said, these things don't exist unless there is a purpose for them. And actually, I looked up what Elizabeth Lev, she obviously was interviewed in the wake of the Notre Dame fires. And she said that, much like the Great Pyramids of Giza or the Pantheon of Rome, Lev said Notre Dame stood as a testament to how humanity can create astonishing things when people direct their ingenuity to something outside themselves. It reminds us that we are greater than our brief mortal lives and the petty pursuits that fill it, she said. But when human beings dedicate themselves to the divine, the transcendent, the experience of God redeeming creation, they can make something sublime.
Yeah, I think that's so telling that almost any building that's dedicated to humankind rather than the divine tends to just be less awe-inspiring. Even when you think of the great palaces and they have a massive grandeur in and of themselves, but they don't
have the same kind of hushed awe about them.
Yeah.
But they can be really moving as well. I would say that it isn't just reserved for the sacred, but I think those kind of buildings made a lot more sense when people understood how to make sacred buildings.
Yeah.
Then there was a way to inform you on how to make impressive secular buildings as well.
Yeah, I remember I noticed in Prague a couple of years ago, we went to visit the castle and there was a cathedral in the castle as well. And the cathedral was still perfectly intact and all of the pieces of art and in its full glory of art and architecture together. Whereas the castle, every time the king changed, all of the pictures were of the old kings and they stripped them out. Or, maybe the dynasty changed or whatever. But they stripped it.
Yeah.
So the castle, which would have been full of tapestries and all sorts of pieces to make this space understandable and like translate it for you, were gone. So you just had kind of a bare space that was meant to hold art and no longer did.
Yeah.
Because things had changed and it was gone.
I think what informs this so well is the section that when I found out that Notre Dame was burning, was the section that I was talking to Phoebe about, which, if anyone has read The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I think it's interesting that the protagonist of The Hunchback of Notre Dame is in the title, except that it's Notre Dame and not The Hunchback. And the book seems to be 1/3 plot and 2/3 a treatise on architecture, which I actually enjoy those sections a lot. But I did make Phoebe laugh one time because I listened to it on audiobook. Actually, I've just realised I haven't finished it because
You didn't finish it?
No, because I had it allotted in for how many hours I had to listen to, and then I got sick and I just couldn't. So I have that to look forward to. I can finish it in Rome. That might be slightly incongruent, but maybe appropriate. But I was listening to it on audiobook, like I said, and I was driving from my parents' home to our flat in Dublin, which is about an hour and a half drive. And I arrived in and I said, for the last hour and a half, I have had a single description of Notre Dame and then Paris. And that is all I got for that whole hour and a half of listening. There was no plot, no dialogue, nothing except this long kind of tract about Notre Dame and its surrounding environments. But I actually really enjoyed it. I actually think Hugo really brings out his own voice quite a lot when he's doing this. But the section that I was actually thinking for this podcast is a chapter called This Will Kill That.
Yes, that was the one that you just handed to me this morning. You went, read now.
Yeah. You read this and then we'll record this podcast. And it's a long diversion, essentially, where it had begun with Claude Frollo, who is reading a book of alchemy and looking out at his cathedral of Notre Dame. And he says...
Specifically a book of alchemy published by the Gutenberg Press. Like by the new printing press.
Yes, and he says, the book will kill the edifice. Hugo then goes on to look into that phrase and says, on some level, you can read it as just saying that the press will kill the church, which I think is oddly prescient as well, that like we see now how the world consumes news and consumes media and consumes endless Twitter feeds and all of that, and say, you know, the press has killed the church in the way that religiosity is diminished. But then he goes on to say, the other truth about that statement is that printing will kill architecture. And that the arrival of the printing press and the wide availability of printed materials, the need for architecture to work as a language diminishes drastically.
Yeah, that was incredible. We could just read out the entire essay, but I think we're only going to quote about half of it. But yeah, he kind of talks through how architecture was the expression of humankind in telling their stories.
Yeah, and I love how he breaks it down to even a stone is a letter and an arch is a hieroglyph and an arcade is a syllable, and which I just love that he would even like break it down that far.
I'm going to read his introduction to this before we go any further. Here was a premonition that human thought had advanced and in changing was about to change its mode of expression, that the important idea of each new generation would be recorded in a new way, that the book of stone, so solid and enduring, was about to be supplanted by the paper book, which would become more enduring still. In this respect, the vague formula of the archdeacon had a second meaning, that one art would dethrone another art. It meant printing will destroy architecture.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating section. I don't actually agree with everything that he says. I don't think anyone can look around Rome and look at the Berninis and say, those are no good. But he essentially makes the point that after the Gothic era, that architecture falls into decline.
Or rather, he says it starts imitating and loses its new expression.
Yeah.
Which I think, to me, is the more compelling a point to falling into decline. Because he doesn't particularly like the new expression, I think. Mm-hmm. But for us, things like New Romanesque or Neo-Gothic or like imitating St. Peter's, for us, those have brought us great beauty in our own countries.
Yeah.
And they brought some of the beauty of Rome home to us.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways we would disagree with his argument there, but it still has the telling point in that, like, he talks about the transition between Romanesque and Gothic, and then kind of argues that the expressions after that aren't developments in the same way.
Yeah. And the other aspect of it is that once architecture is not so foundational or so, like he says, it's tyrannical, that the arts that go into architecture are then freed. They exceed themselves in a certain way because they're not necessarily tied to architecture. But then he also kind of makes the point that once they're on their own, there's a less of a sense of a unity, and the edifice or the monument as a whole suffers because you essentially have 1,000 individual arts that are making up one space rather than something that is entirely coherent in and of itself, because all of it is part of the one structure.
Yeah, he's talking about whether architecture will have a revival, and says, the great fortune of having an architect of genius may befall the 20th century, like Dante in the 13th. But architecture will never be the social, collective, dominant art that it was. The great poem, the great structure, the great masterwork of humanity will never again be built. It will be printed. And yeah, he talks about, before that, the printing press, of every poetry being subservient to architecture, music being subservient to architecture.
And I love, he has a phrase where he said that in the sense of these arts being subject to it, that no issue except in the direction of architecture, it gushed forth through that art, and its Iliads assumed the form of cathedrals.
Yeah, but the great poets of that era became architects.
Yeah, and so it's just fascinating, and I think just after this we're going to talk a little bit about how, and it's funny, in some ways we've lost it in poetry as well. I feel like we've just been casting off meaning left, right and centre, but that we used to have a language of symbols in art and architecture that you could easily point to.
Yeah, I think in that we've lost a lot of, by our ability to tell a story without symbolism, we've lost a lot of our understanding of symbolism. And I'm going to quote another section on symbolism because I spotted it here. On the other hand, the great characteristic of popular architectures are the variety, progress, originality, opulence, and perpetual movement. They have something human about them, which they constantly mix with the divine symbolism under which they still occur. Hence, structures are accessible to every soul, to every intelligence, to every imagination. Though symbolic, they are easily comprehensible, like nature herself. I think to a great sense we've lost that ability to read architecture.
Yeah, and I'm going to quote a section, and I think it's so funny because we both pulled out quotes, and this section is so dense that we actually have not pulled out any of the same quotes.
That's brilliant.
But yeah, there's two sections that specifically you can read in the Hunchback of Notre Dame that are just specifically about architecture. There's, I think it's book 3, there's a chapter just titled Notre Dame, and then the following chapter is called A Bird's Eye View of Paris, which is all about just the art and architecture. And then this section, like I said, that we're quoting from is just a chapter called This Will Kill That.
Yeah, it's chapter 2 in book 5.
Yeah.
Pretty short. It took me like half an hour maybe.
And it's not necessarily tied to the story. So if you are just interested, I mean, you know, if you're interested in reading the story itself, it also won't spoil the story if you don't have time to read that just now. But if you do want to just dip into those architecture bits, it's scattered throughout, but those are two kind of large chunks where he goes into it in great detail.
Yeah, they're just beautifully written.
They're really, really good. This is what I was saying, that like I was caught because I sort of resented him for stalling the story for so long. But at the same time, I felt like that was where his writing was at his best. So I didn't really want to hold it against him because I actually enjoyed those sections a lot. But anyway, so what I was saying about where art was kind of liberated from architecture and the effect that had, and I'm going to quote this section also because it goes into detail about St. Peter's, which is very relevant for where we are. So he says, nevertheless, from the moment when architecture is no longer anything but an art like any other, as soon as it is no longer the total art, the sovereign art, the tyrant art, It has no longer the power to retain the other arts. So they emancipate themselves, break the yoke of architecture, and take themselves off, each one in its own direction. Each one of them gains by this divorce. Isolation aggrandizes everything. Sculpture becomes statuary. The image trade becomes painting. The canon becomes music. One would pronounce it an empire dismembered at the death of its Alexander, and whose provinces become kingdoms. Hence Raphael, Michelangelo, Jean Goujon, Palestrina, those splendors of the dazzling 16th century. Farewell all sap, all originality, all life, all intelligence. It drags along, a lamentable workshop mendicant from copy to copy. Michelangelo, who no doubt felt even in the 16th century that it was dying, had a last idea, an idea of despair. That titan of art piled the Pantheon on the Pantheon and made St. Peter's at Rome, a great work which deserved to remain unique, the last originality of architecture, the signature of a giant artist at the bottom of the colossal register of stone which was closed forever. With Michelangelo dead, what does this miserable architecture which survived itself in the state of a spectre do? It takes St. Peter in Rome, it copies it and parodies it. It is a mania, it is a pity. Each century has its St. Peter's of Rome. In the 17th century, the Val de la Grace. In the 18th century, Saint Genevieve. Each country has its St. Peter's of Rome. London has one, Petersburg another, Paris has 2 or 3. The insignificant testament, the last dotage of a decrepit grand art falling back into infancy before it dies. Which, like I said...
It's very harsh.
It's very, very harsh. Although it does kind of explain how he's saying that Gothic architecture is the pinnacle, and yet in the 16th century you have this like dazzling array of people because it's this moment where all of the other arts break free.
Yeah, and he just describes it as like the last sunset as well.
Yeah.
Which I think is very telling in that the sunset is often the most beautiful part of the day.
Yeah. Like I said, I certainly wouldn't write off everything after Michelangelo, but...
Goodness, no, we'd be in trouble if we did.
But I do think it is really interesting that he's talking about how architecture can unify a culture. And it reminded me of, I was reading an article, it was called To Make Britain Richer, Make Britain Beautiful. And it was talking about how investing in beautiful spaces, like even just housing and streets, like not even sacred spaces, just the places where people live, how investing in those and making those beautiful actually improves the economy and improves the standard of living and has all of these ramifications that people wouldn't expect. And it has some really interesting quotes in there. So it says things like, but the establishment fell in love with ugliness just as governments become more committed than ever to our well-being. Just not, apparently, when we are looking at things. Our politics doesn't notice the things we notice. So why did beauty cease to be a public good? Goes on to talk about how the fact that we don't have any kind of unifying form or how all of the new buildings, like it's specifically talking about London, and I think anyone who knows London, they keep building these huge buildings and they all get hideous names like the Gherkin or the Hatchet because they're just sort of oblong obelisks in different directions and they don't have any coherency to them. And he says, welcome to London, we believe nothing, but this faddishness keeps the mind in the tumult of the here and now. Styles whose motifs have persisted expand our sense of time, granting, like the sea, a sense of perspective. The same phenomenon is apparent across the world. Despite a building boom unprecedented in human history, modern China has created no new Venice. Indeed, no new Suzhou. Tourists everywhere now crush into the places built before the last century, vacationing being also a holiday for the eyes. But that tells us something. If we preserve it, beauty pays.
Yeah, that's very telling. And I think tying back into what we were saying earlier about architecture having once been like the overarching form, I think because architecture has lost the way of displaying art. Like I think in these fabulous churches we see art and architecture intertwined so deeply that you can't read one without the other.
Yeah.
Like you have a plinth without a statue and it's an eyesore.
Yeah.
Like, not quite an eyesore, but you know what I mean. You know what belongs there and yet it is lacking. And then when we get to modern buildings, they don't even have the plinth. There is no space for art.
Mm-hmm.
The art used to be this great expression,
Mm-hmm.
and yet when now art has gone so modernistic, that sounds very dubious. There is some atrocious modern art, I think, as we all know, that we don't have beautiful spaces just to be beautiful. Art belongs in museums, kind of, or maybe on the wall of your home, but not so much. It definitely doesn't belong in your office foyer. In a certain way, like...
Yeah, and even when it does, I am someone, I think Phoebe will back me up on this, that I will try to go out of my way to point out good examples of modern art and show that there are interesting, great things happening in certain parts. I often have this feeling when looking at more modern pieces where I'm like, oh, I can see what they're doing there. That's kind of interesting. But I don't leap to it. There's nothing in my soul that kind of goes, yes, that, you know?
Yeah.
And so even
like,
when it's...
the very soul is lacking in it.
Yeah, so even when something is not offensively bad or just plain ugly, that there isn't the same kind of emotional connection that I get when I look at something that, and I don't want to say the Pietà, because who can be Michelangelo? Like, I understand that, who can be Mozart? It's the same kind of thing. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy lots of other types of music.
Yeah.
But that...
Even like Caravaggio or...
Yeah, there's a whole range of people, like your heart sort of leaps within you when you see them.
And also, I think, to a certain sense, you can read them.
Yeah.
And they tell you something about what the artist is trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then because they're sacred pieces, they tell you something about your faith and about you.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this in terms of architecture is that I was reading a really genuinely fascinating article called The Neuroscience of Architecture, the Good, the Bad and the Beautiful. It was an article about a research paper which was tracking eye movements when people were looking at certain buildings and certain facades and things like that, and how that impacts our neurochemistry, and that it actually does, and that it, kind of quantifiably does. It says that the new sciences also cast a new light on the age-old topic of beauty. It now seems that what we experience as beautiful is a shared perception of beneficial conditions in our environment. We see beauty in a healthy meadow or fresh fruit, for example, whereas rotten fruit or a fire-swept meadow will likely be experienced as ugly. Beauty is not simply in the eye of the beholder, as was once held. It is the result of complex structural interaction between the viewer and the environment, with significant impacts on our health and well-being. And it goes on to say, research also shows us that it is architects who are often in the minority about what constitutes good or beautiful design from a user's perspective. Eye tracking experiments revealed that built structures that follow the contemporary aesthetic of geometrical fundamentalism are often ignored as if they were not there. Other evidence shows that such structures can be stress-inducing and consequently degrade the quality of life of people who live around them.
I love that so much.
And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about our experience of seeing more contemporary art. There is no small irony in this, since it's maintained often by the same professionals that architecture is a subjective art form whose aesthetic quality is only in the eye of the beholder. When new fashionable projects are criticised by citizens as ugly, out of character, or even anxiety-inducing, such criticisms are often dismissed as mere opinion.
Yeah, that is so telling that actually, no, there can be objectively beautiful.
And I think it's hilarious because it actually ties back to what Victor Hugo was saying. So in the first section, which was just about Notre Dame, I don't think you read this bit, Phoebe, but he says, fashions have wrought more harm than revolutions. They have cut to the quick, they have attacked to the very bone and framework of art. They have cut, slashed, disorganized, killed the edifice in the form as in the symbol, in its consistency as well as in its beauty, and they have made it over, a presumption which neither time nor revolution have at least been guilty. They have audaciously adjusted in the name of good taste upon the wounds of Gothic architecture.
Yeah, you can tell Victor Hugo is a big fan of the Gothic.
Yeah, absolutely. In that section, he's talking about the three things that are destroying architecture and their time, revolution, and fashion. So he then goes on to, he sums up, he says, thus, to sum up the points which we have indicated, three sorts of ravages today disfigure Gothic architecture. Wrinkles and warts on the epidermis. This is the work of time. Deeds of violence, brutality, contusions, fractures. This is the work of the revolutions from Luther to Mirabeau. Mutilations, amputations, dislocation of the joints, restorations. This is the Greek, Roman, and barbarian work of professors according to Vitruvius and Vignole. This magnificent art produced by the Vandals has been slain by the academics. The centuries, the revolutions, which at least devastate with impartiality and grandeur, have been joined by a cloud of school architects, licensed, sworn, and bound by oath, defacing with discernment and choice of bad taste.
Ah, that's great. Talking of the revolution, it reminds me of something that our tour guide yesterday said.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about the Baroque style, and he said that because it was during the Counter-Reformation, and he said where Luther and the other Protestants were stripping the churches bare and taking out the statues, taking out the colour, they go, oh, so you say no colour, all the colours. You say no gold, all the gold. No statues, everywhere can we put a statue, one by one.
Yeah.
That kind of like excessive abundance of overreaction.
Which there's a part of me that really loves.
It's just great.
Yeah.
And while we were talking about modern art and architecture and expressions of that, I think it is fair to say one of the good expressions of that here in Rome is the chapel of the Irish College here, which has these beautiful mosaics. They're quite recent, aren't they?
Yeah, very
2010?
recent. Yeah.
The altar is in an arch, and there's a mosaic almost in a dome behind it of Irish saints, and Mary and John the Baptist, and it is modern. Like the faces are different to what you would otherwise expect, but it's also this beautifully crafted mosaic that actually shows artistry and skill. And then you've got like Saint Bridget with like water flowing, and Saint Patrick with like the church, and like all these symbols that we're accustomed to beautifully displayed. I do think it's telling that is an example of beautiful art, but not so much of architecture. Like the only architecture is that dome, which isn't structural.
Yeah.
The actual, I think because they would have refurbished it anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not a criticism of the space in any way. I'm just saying that we don't have an example of art and architecture combined in a modern way that we're aware of. Yeah,
and that it feels distinctly 21st century. If you want more hope, I would also, I've been following this for a while. There was someone who used the hashtag unbeige my parish.
Oh, that was great.
Which was hilarious, which then I also found a kind of version of in the Liturgical Arts Journal, which has a whole series of articles on before and afters of churches being remodeled and repainted and texture and art added, because that was one of the things we were saying, is that you see these churches and they were so unafraid of having art everywhere, whereas I think now we kind of isolate art and say, well, you're looking at this one picture now and then there's one picture over here, whereas I think there's just such a beauty in embracing the idea of having art everywhere. But I think what we're lacking is the fact that in order to do that now, you would need to have so much meaning in everything. Like there's also like prohibitiveness in like skill and expertise and money and interest in doing these things.
I do also think it's telling, like, even you have these beautiful domes that still have these ornate paintings way up there where you can hardly see them.
Yeah.
And they're almost, it's like, well, it doesn't matter if you can see them or not, they're there.
Yeah. And I think, because to me that really replicates God's creation. Like Mother Angelica once talked about an experience where she was on an excursion. I can't remember the context really, but I think she was with some of her sisters, and they found this glade with a river flowing through it, and the sun was shining, and there was, rainbow trout like glittering in the river, and it was just beautiful. and she was saying how like this existed before me and the sister showed up. So there was this like little glade of humanity that was giving glory to God without, it's that kind of Buddhist thing of like if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. But we are saying it is like all of creation gives glory to God, whether we as humanity are even there to see it. And so in some ways the idea that parts of the church that might never get seen still give glory to God and still send up this praise.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And that in that small way we are trying to replicate God's creation.
And I think Victor Hugo has a little bit to say on why we don't do that, or why that's so hard to bring back. In that, again, he's talking about architecture or printing, and which one is going to come back. It says, architecture is dead, irrevocably dead, killed by the printed book, killed because it is less endurable, killed because it is more costly. Every cathedral costs millions. Imagine now the cost necessary to rewrite the architectural book, the cost of rebuilding those countless edifices and spreading them once more over the land. I think that's kind of part of what we're saying, in that there is also a massive cost element involved, and without the divine inspiration, you can't put that kind of money into it.
Yeah, absolutely. The other element that we were saying that we've really lost is this language of symbolism, and how much that impacts our ability to make art and even our structure of architecture. Like one of the coolest things that Elizabeth Lev pointed out was how, you know, the Romans made these triumphal arches, and then how that shape was put into churches.
Yeah, that particularly in Santa Maria Maggiore, where they've got this triumphal arch, and the story that they've written, where the Romans would have written the story of like the success and triumph in battle, they have written, again in picture format, the story of the success and triumph of Christ and the incarnation of Christ, which was just like such a mind-blowing, beautiful, like, boom, here you go.
Yeah. But then we've seen so many angels holding palm leaves over depictions of saints. That's meant to symbolise the palm of victory, because they've won the race and they've come first because they're martyrs. And so every time you see a palm leaf, you're thinking of a martyr. Every time you see the colour red, you're thinking of a martyr. You know, that you can have these languages and of colour and like symbols and natural symbols and
the position and
every little motif can mean something. Or the way that in Santa Maria Maggiore, she was explaining that the types of pillars were chosen because they were the feminine style columns, and that
they've got the curly hair on top,
the woman's form. And so that every part of everything could be chosen to serve a particular means and a particular end.
And that even like the form was particular, like the spacing between the columns was like 4 times or something.
Yeah.
The column width, and then the spacing the other way was maybe 8 times the column width. That kind of exact precision of everything means something, and the whole space is cohesive.
Yeah, that anything that you can look to has a symbolic meaning. And I think in some ways, we were talking about how like the printing press takes over from this. In some ways, language retained the artistic symbolism for quite a while, that you could write a poem in which someone gets a palm and the people reading it might know what that means. And I think we seem to just step further and further away from those things, so that it's harder and harder to have meaning. And it was funny, I brought this up with Elizabeth Lev as well, that there was, I think it was, the Harvard professor of architecture wrote about Notre Dame. This was a wonderful opportunity to rebuild in a new style, because the ceilings had been, and I quote, overburdened with meaning, which, as I was saying, that's certainly something that we need to, that we're trying to get away from in the current age is
we can't have more than one meaning.
Well, just that like anyone in our current era might be overburdened with meaning.
Which I think is funny, because then we spend so long in school dissecting pieces and trying to devolve meaning after meaning after meaning.
Yeah. And so that this almost fear of having meaning is just so mind-blowing in the context of when you see these great buildings that, like you said, I'm not going to say overburdened, because that's negative, but someone else described the ceilings, that to them the saddest part of the ceilings being burnt was that they had been soaked with thousands of years of prayer, that the idea that the prayers went up and were soaked into those ceilings,
That's incredible.
That, if anything, meaning is something that we cannot have enough of. It could be so inspiring to regain that sense of meaning in what we're doing. But that we were also discussing this on the tour, that like how almost impossible it feels like it would be to recreate this in this modern era, because there is no cohesive sense of meaning. Not only is architecture gone, but like the core ideas of Christianity are gone, which I would say Victor Hugo was very, very anti-Catholic by the end of his life, so I'm not sure he would necessarily contest that. But that when you lose that kind of core foundation of orientation, like we said at the start, where Michelangelo oriented Rome towards Peter, that it's the London now where you have like all of your different types of skyscrapers to their different idols of companies and gods and data and
that all, because all of those idols are limited. What is built for them is also limited.
Yeah. And that actually it's maybe fitting to close this out on just a final quote from that section of Notre Dame, where he's talking about how the press, that giant machine which incessantly pumps all the intellectual sap of society, belches forth without pause fresh materials for its work. The whole human race is on the scaffoldings. Each mind is a mason. The humblest fills his hole or places his stone. Rétif de Le Breton brings his hod of plaster. Every day a new course rises, independently of the original and the individual contribution of each writer. Assuredly, it is a construction which increases and piles up in endless spirals. There also are confusion of tongues, incessant activity, indefatigable labour, eager competition of all humanity, refuge promised to intelligence, a new flood against an overflow of barbarians. It is the second Tower of Babel of the human race. And if that is not true of modern society, I don't know what is. But I think in order to go on enjoying the beautiful landscapes of Rome, Phoebe and I were going to have to round this up now.
Yeah, definitely.
And come to a crashing halt by asking each other what we're enjoying at the moment.
And I'm not allowed to say buildings?
Well, I think I'm going to have to say that everything previous to this holiday is a bit of a blur for me right now. Did I have a life? Did I have anything going on except this horrendous food poisoning? So I'm trying to think what I'm enjoying at the moment.
You could talk about buildings and I could talk about a book if you wish.
Yeah, I'm enjoying Rome. Who wouldn't enjoy Rome?
I know, it's great. Let's see. I was watching an anime earlier this week in preparation for going to Japan.
Of course.
It's called Erased. It's on Netflix, so it's pretty accessible, and it's just really pretty and quite clever, and it's not like super happy, but it's not too dark either. It's not too weird in the way some animes can be. But yeah, no, it's just a really nicely told story.
Cool.
I'm only about 3 episodes into it, so I'm looking forward to picking the rest of that up again. And then I've also been reading another George MacDonald, because that just seems to be my life at the moment. So anytime I'm lacking in something to read, I just go and read another George MacDonald. So this one was called The Life of Clare Skymer, and it was just this beautifully told story about this foundling boy who's rescued by a Parson couple in Italy, actually, when his parents have been killed by an earthquake, and his interaction with animals and his pure honesty. And it's a real way of writing a person who challenges you without saying, oh, everybody should be like that. Because you can see very easily how if all our world was like him, nobody would get anything done. But there was just this beautiful description of this boy who's maybe now 12, and he's wandering from town to town begging and sleeping rough, but so honest that he won't steal. And he sleeps in the lee of a gypsy tent, but he leaves before morning because he doesn't want to be tempted to take anything that they offer him that might be stolen.
Wow.
And it's just, that beautiful way of showing a connection with animals, like this great loyalty to his dog that makes him turn away work if they say, oh, you have to get rid of the dog. Like that great loyalty and that great honesty which isn't practical, but it's challenging and it's striking.
Yeah. I have actually remembered something I did enjoy recently. I went to the cinema, which is relatively unusual for me. I went to see Sisters Brothers, which is a Western. It's kind of like a twisted Western. It's not your usual one. It stars Joaquin Phoenix and John C. Reilly, Jake Gyllenhaal. And I'm not going to say, because it's not like super enjoyable, but it's very engaging and very well done. And so I enjoyed that very much. And I would recommend it. It's got some kind of brutal scenes in it.
So it's not P-rated?
No, it's not P-rated. It's not rated for Phoebe. But it has a lot of very realistic elements in it, while also being maybe very slightly a bit of a kind of a dark comedy as well. So yes, I really enjoyed that. And I want to thank everyone for listening. I'm being very optimistic when I listen back to this. Obviously, we're staying in a lovely apartment in Rome, but we have a lot less control over the sound quality and the noises going past outside.
Yeah, there's been a shutter swinging open and shut for the entire episode.
Yeah,
so if you can hear that, we're very sorry.
Yeah, so apologies if the sound quality is not as good. Thanks for bearing with us, and thanks for coming on the journey with us. And thanks very much for listening. Thanks for everyone who's there's been some people who've reached out, and I really, really appreciate that. It's really wonderful and very uplifting. And yeah, if you can rate and subscribe and leave reviews and any of those things that kind of engage and help promote the podcast, we really, really appreciate it. And other than that, I think it's just time to say goodbye.
Bye!
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.